Hi, everybody. It's Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Just working our way into June 30th, 2019, the 27th day of Sivan, 5779. Had a beautiful Shabbat. Hope that you did as well. Very interesting week last week. And that's actually what this show is about. Pre-taped a couple of sections earlier last week at the Law and War Conference sponsored by Shurat Hadin in Jerusalem. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear from Professor Avi Bell and also from Ann Hertzberg of NGO Monitor. I could have spent the entire time just interviewing people. Amazing panels, fabulous people that were there. But I grabbed these two, and the other ones I'll get on future shows. NGO Monitor came up again on Shabbat because I was reading Makor Rishon, which is the really great Hebrew paper that I get and read on Shabbat. And there was a huge article finally about the Palestinian Authority land grab all over Area C in Judea and Samaria. So we've got 40% of Judea and Samaria, areas A and B, that already are completely off limits to Jews because of the Oslo Accords. Then we've got Area C, which is where the Jewish communities are, and you see that the Palestinian Authority, aided and abetted by the Europeans, which is where NGO Monitor comes in, because they've been following that money and paper trail, have established, they've doubled the number of buildings in the last 10 years under this prime minister's watch. And there is now more area controlled in Area C by the Palestinian Authority, or by illegal building by Palestinian Arabs, than there is legal Jewish communities. So it's like Nadia Matar said years ago, in Gush Katif in Gaza, they took the fish out of the tank, meaning the Jewish communities. Here, they're taking the water out. We've been seeing it happen all over the place. Finally, because of Regavim, the great organization, we've got some numbers. Who is going to do anything about it? That is a great question. That remains for a show in and of itself. And this is something that just got my blood boiling again because I don't understand. I just don't understand what's going on here. In any event, Law and War Conference was really, really excellent. Avi Bell will be talking about morality in war. There were some excellent panels there with generals on them who were pretty much just saying to all of us little people, trust us. But unfortunately, since it was a general, Ariel Sharon, that took us out of Gaza, and since there have been other generals who haven't made the greatest decisions. So in talking to one of my kids who's studying international relations, he makes that point that the army is just one factor when you have diplomacy and when you have to make decisions, not just diplomacy, but when you have to make decisions in a country, the leadership of a country about certain things that you have to do. So obviously the opinion of the army is incredibly important, especially in a country like Israel, but it's just one factor that has to be weighed along with a lot of them. And so that's why we see a lot of what's happening here. Over 100 fires outside of Gaza in the fields of the people that I know and their homes, right around Gaza just this last week. So that's incredibly upsetting. And I understand why we can't go in and just wage war without an end game on Hamas in Gaza. But a lot of these things are building up. And at some point you just get the sense that this can just keeps getting kicked down the road, and it's not going away, and things are just getting worse. News in, I don't listen, of course, to the news on Shabbat, but turned on the computer right after Shabbat to hear that some of the Palestinian Authority businessmen who went to Bahrain last week in order to really participate in what looks like the United States and the world is really trying to get the Palestinian economy going and give them a better life. And these guys went there and they were just arrested by the Palestinian Authority. So it's like, some of us are playing on a certain field where we just want to make the lives better for the people around us. But we're playing against people who that is absolutely not what they want to do. And anybody who tries to have normal relations with Israel or with anybody else is going to be punished. So hopefully these guys will be let out. Hopefully the American administration at least will lean on that. But just the fact that they were arrested at all shows you how far from coexistence we are, because that's not what at least the leadership of the Palestinian Authority wants. They want to destroy Israel. It's super clear. So people are going to keep trying in all different ways, but this is what we're up against, and we have to be realistic about that. But I did have a lot of fun one night last week. Went to an Idan Reichel concert. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his music. Just beautiful music, lots of different artists on the stage. men, women, gorgeous voices, unbelievable music being played on a variety of instruments, and just a real sense. It was a beautiful night in Jerusalem, in Sultan's Pools, which used to be a reservoir in the Second Temple period, backdrop the old city walls. And it was just like, listening to Hebrew music. It was just like a little piece of something great, with all the chaos and the busyness and the work and the news, to just really enjoy an evening of artistry and with a good friend, and just feel like, wow, like this is what I came home for on Monday, on Kafchet, on the 20th day of Sivan. It's not just my wedding anniversary, but it's 31 years since we made Aliyah, since we moved here. And it's been a totally wild ride, and nothing I would change for anything. A real privilege to be here, and not a day goes by that I just don't thank Hashem for the fact that I get to live in the land. So a lot going on last week. A lot's going to be going on this week too, I hope. I'll fill you guys in on the next Rejuvenation. So in the meantime, let's get over to the interviews. You guys, if you're new to the podcast, you haven't experienced some of what we've gone through together in the last few years, you're welcome to go to my website, eveharrow.com, see what I'm up to, see when I'm traveling, bring me into your communities, and catch up on some of the fabulous interviews that I've been privileged to have over the years, and just what I do and how I tour Israel, and just try and bring this country in any way that I can to whomever I can. So I hope you all have a great week. And Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation, thanks to Tabitha and to Ben on the network. And take care, everybody. Enjoy the interviews. This is the intake and the outtake. So just understand the show's going to just end with Anne. But that's the way it is for this week. Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It is another beautiful day in Jerusalem. This time I'm in the air conditioning. It's June 25th, 2019, and I am on top of Mount Scopus at the Dan Hotel for a part of a law and war conference sponsored by Shurat Hadin. Just came out of one of the sessions where I saw old friend Professor Avi Bell, who just does amazing things, and I'll let him tell you all the amazing things that he's doing, and then we'll get a couple of questions in before he's got to run off. So first of all, Avi, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to see you again.
Okay, so where are you teaching, working? You're all over the place these days.
All right, I'll give you the short bio. I'm a professor of law at the University of San Diego and at Bar Ilan University. I'm also a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School this year, and I'm a permanent fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum in Jerusalem. And then I've got some other things that I won't bore your listeners.
In your spare time between 2 and 3 in the morning.
Exactly. I think that if I go on, then I will end up chewing up all the time we have left.
All right, so what is your specialty in law?
I deal with actually a number of different fields, but I think the most important thing for purposes of our discussion is I deal with issues of international law, international institutions, and the laws of war.
Okay, that's fairly broad. So just to jump to something, because I was in a session now where you were on the panel, and we were talking about, there's a lot of discussion about morality and warfare, and also how the world treats Israel. And it seems to be pretty clear to most of us, and I don't think we're being paranoid, that there's somewhat of a double standard when it comes to Israel. And I noticed a reaction in the crowd when there was a question about morality in war. And it's something also that I've been picking up for many years here in Israel, that there's many Israelis who feel that we have the most moral army in the world. We are a country that acts with tremendous morality. Our enemies are possibly the least moral people in the world, and therefore we go into battle holding up this flag of morality. We end up burying our children and our soldiers in order to save their civilians. And it's like we're fighting with both hands tied behind our backs. So how would you respond to that?
Let's distinguish between what actually morals require of us and what they say is morality. So I don't think that we really have to fight with our hands tied behind our backs. I think that when a Supreme Court president here says that it's a strength of Israel that one hand is always tied behind our back, I don't think that's true. I think that morality allows us to act vigorously to defend ourselves. I think that morality allows us to protect the lives of our soldiers and of our civilians. I think that the law does and the morality does. That said, just because they abuse the term to tell us that we can't do things doesn't mean we should forget who we are and what makes us better. we have a moral code. It's important that we do. That's part of what makes us us. And we shouldn't forget that just because they abuse the term. I don't think we should care at all about what they say about us. If they say we're acting immorally, that's not the question. The question is, are we acting immorally objectively? The way we understand it, our best understanding of what our conscience and God requires of us, that is the way we should be acting. And what others say about it, we know that no matter what we do, they'll always say that we're acting immorally. No matter what we do, they'll always call us criminals. But we still can't forget who we are.
So years ago, I think it was after the Second Lebanon War, there was a soldier at my table who had just come back from the war, and he was telling us that he was sitting in a tank during the war, and he saw, I guess it was a Hezbollah terrorist because they were fighting in Lebanon, holding a child, presumably a Lebanese child, in front of him with an anti-tank missile aimed at the tank that the soldier was sitting in. Now, they hesitated. They did not shoot the terrorist because he's holding a child in front of him. And the only reason that the soldier was sitting at my table in order to tell the story is because the anti-tank missile, a rocket, obviously misfired. So now, I'm thinking to myself, because we do imbue our children, our entire society with that idea. You don't kill children. You don't harm civilians. Yet they're using that against us. So I understand what you're saying about that morality. On the other hand, there's also, it's immoral to die in order to protect other people. And you're an expert in international law. So is there a gap between morality and international law? And where do we fall into that?
There's a big gap between what people talk about and what the reality is. So this situation that soldier was describing, in which there's a terrorist with an anti-tank missile holding a child as a human shield, international law says that you can shoot the terrorist even though the child is in the way. And I think that our moral code tells us the same thing. As tragic as it is that the child is likely to be harmed, it's still the more moral choice to stop the terrorist from shooting. So I don't think the issue is there a gap between morality and international law, although there is such a gap. I think that the bigger issue is there's a gap between what they're telling us the law and morals require and what they really require. And I don't know that, by the way, when you're talking about a situation like this, I don't know that this is even a case where the double standard that's applied against us is the issue. The issue is that the soldier who was sitting at your table is a human being with a conscience, and it's not natural for somebody who has a soul and an understanding of morality to want to shoot an innocent child. It's just not. It's not a natural thing. I don't think that we should blame ourselves for that. That's a good thing. I'm happy that he felt that that's unnatural. I'm happy that he feels there's something wrong about that.
Why do you think there is a double standard against Israel?
JEWS. There's.
Is this another platform for anti-Semitism?
Let's just say that there is a unique standard that's applied to the Jewish state, where almost everything that the Jewish state is considered to be illegal, and when the same actions are carried out by other states in the world, it's not considered to be illegal. So you have all these cases where Israeli military doctrine is specifically based on NATO doctrine. So we're talking about following the practices of the world's democracies, not the non-democratic states, but the world's democracies. And nonetheless, even though we're doing the same thing that NATO countries, NATO armies are doing, when Israel does it, it's considered wrong. When the NATO countries do it, it's considered right. Now, what explains the different standard for the Jewish state? I don't want to say that the motive is anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism, right? That if you're treating the Jews differently and worse than you're treating others, whatever your motive is, that's anti-Semitism.
So I think some of the frustration here, though, is that some of this comes from Jews or from Israel itself. For example, the famous Goldstone report, which later on was thrown out of years ago.
Yeah, I don't think that there is a genetic immunity against anti-Semitism. So being born Jewish doesn't mean that you can't be bigoted against Jews. So the fact that it often happens that the people who are promulgating the anti-Semitism are themselves Jewish, like Noam Chomsky, doesn't mean that it's not anti-Semitism. It's still bigotry against Jews. There are cases when we do it to ourselves. If the state of Israel imposes upon itself a harsher standard than the rest of the world, that I wouldn't say is bigotry. That's just a misjudgment. That's not us treating ourselves differently because we're Jews. It's us treating ourselves differently because it's us. It's perfectly okay for me to hold myself to a higher standard than I hold others. It is not acceptable for anyone else to do so. Right? Anyone else in the world has to hold me to the same standard. If they are holding me to a higher and different and harsher standard, that's bigotry. If I do it to myself, I may be a person of conscience or I may be a sucker.
So in your work on the Kohelet Policy Forum, isn't that some of what they're trying to do, like also helping to write the last basic law, is to get Israel, maybe the court system here, specifically the Supreme Court and the judges, to be more in line with what's reasonable?
In general, we have a problem in Israel with the overreaching of the legal bureaucracy and of the courts. There was a recent speech that former Supreme Court President Aaron Barak gave, in which he was asked about whether he was holding back the military too much in his judgments, and he said, "No, I should have held them back more," which I think shows a stunning misunderstanding of his role and the way to treat these legal and moral challenges. So, yeah, I think that there is a problem with overreaching of the legal bureaucracy and of the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court, and that is one of the main issues that the Kohelet Policy Forum tackles, is how to return the power to elected officials that has been seized by the legal bureaucracy and the courts.
So we had, there was a video making its way around in the last few days of, apparently, and it's not clear if it was doctored, a couple of soldiers running away from Arabs who were throwing stones. And some pundits were saying that it's because the soldiers are so afraid now to open fire because there's cameras everywhere, and then they'll go to jail, and so they would prefer to get out of that situation. Is this some of what you're talking about here? Because that deterrence also weakens Israel in the eyes of the Arabs. And as we know very well, you and I both living in the Middle East for many, many years, when you're weak, that is not a good thing. To be strong and to be seen as a little bit crazy is what possibly is going to keep you safer than anything else.
I haven't seen the film, so I really can't comment on the film. More generally, are soldiers afraid of prosecution? In some cases they are. It's a problem that the courts and the prosecutorial system reach down too deep and with too harsh a hand. It is important, however, that soldiers understand they have to follow rules. You can't have chaos in a military. You can't have every soldier making up for themselves the rules that they follow. We have a system by which we tell them what the bounds are, and we expect them to follow it. It's difficult, and there may be some misunderstandings, but I don't think that there's a different way to handle it. The bigger problem is that when soldiers make an honest misunderstanding, we may treat them, it's happened, where we treat them as arch criminals rather than as soldiers that didn't quite understand what they were supposed to do.
As a 19-year-old in an impossible situation who has a split second to decide what to do.
Exactly. So that would seem to me somebody who makes a bad decision to shoot when he should have not have shot. That's it seems to me a disciplinary matter and not a criminal matter.
So you're teaching this year, you said, at Harvard Law School. What are your challenges there? Because that's really the school of schools. So how are you finding, how's that going?
I'm just finishing up my fellowship there this year. Harvard is a very interesting place. The world comes to Harvard, and I have to say there's some very fine students there, particularly on the issues that we're talking about. There are some very talented people who understand that some of the things they're being told, anti-Israel narratives that they're hearing, are not true, and they're willing to help. So it's not a uniform picture, but of course there are also those people at Harvard that have been for many years leading the charge against Israel. Some of them as well are fellows there. There's a woman named Sarah Roy who is a fellow in, I believe it's the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard, who's been supported many years and more or less putting out pretty vicious anti-Semitic, anti-Israel propaganda. She's not the only one. So Harvard is a challenging place, but it's also, there's good stuff there.
So what's your biggest concern right now? As somebody who's really an expert in international law, who's now not just in Israel, but has spent significant time outside, as you just said now, meeting other people way out of a comfort zone, what would you say your biggest concern now is? Because you're someone who's very devoted to the law, and this is not something like a side thing. This is really how you think the Western world should run. What would you say you think that there's the big problem here that needs to be overcome?
Well, I can tell you from an Israeli perspective, because as much as I'm in love with the law, that is, I think that it's a profound way of organizing our behavior as a society to act properly. There's such a thing as exaggerating the importance of the law. So I was doing some research on the Sinai campaign of 1956, and there was a memo in the archives that was put together by the legal advisor at the time to the foreign ministry. And he discussed what he thought the legal status was of the Gaza Strip, which was captured by Israel during that campaign. And there were about 4 or 5 pages in which he went through the ins and outs of what he thought the legal status was. That's not the important part. The important part is at the end. He said, now, if you decide to ignore my interpretation of international law, this is all a classified memo. Says if you decide to ignore it, then I would just point out A, B, and C. And I thought that was a very healthy attitude. It's an understanding that international law is as much politics as law. And if you were a legal advisor providing information to the government about international law and some dilemma that it's facing, one of the things you have to understand is that international law is just one of the factors to be taken into account. It's not the biggest factor. It's definitely not the last and decisive factor. It is a factor. And that sort of memo would not be written today by the legal advisor to the foreign ministry. It wouldn't be written by other legal advisors. They wouldn't acknowledge the degree to which international law is simply part of the bigger political picture. And so if what do I think is something that we need to work on? It's that. I think that we have to get legal advisors in this country, in Israel, to get back to a proper understanding of their role, where they don't expect and they shouldn't be the last word. They are people who are providing information to their clients, who are the elected officials of this country.
So it's always intrigued me because this country is a balance between Judaism and democracy, sometimes way to one sometimes way to the other. If, let's say you have a situation, theoretical, we know Hezbollah has many, many missiles, and that at some point they may open up those missiles and shoot towards Israel, and that the only way Israel can stop it is to maybe turn Lebanon into some kind of a parking lot, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of people here, and that means, and we know that some of those missiles are buried under mosques, are buried under kindergartens, a lot of civilians are going to die. So if there was ever, let's say, as you're saying, and I think it's critical what you're saying here, and that my listeners understand this, that the law is one part of it, but there's another law that many of us live by here in Israel, and that's Torah law, which is definitely moral law. It's a whole lot of things, not just moral law. Are there advisors to our leadership that also come from that place? When you have, let's say, a very small group of people who might have to make some terrible decisions, is that at all part of what happens here in this country? Do you know?
Well, I don't know if they're in the sense of, is there somebody who's giving the prime minister advice on what Torah law says to do about a particular mission? No, we don't have such a person. But I will say that the IDF has an ethical code, and the ethical code was put together by a group of people who are Jewish and whose morality is informed, among other sources, it's not the only source, but among the sources are traditional Jewish law sources. That is, not just the Torah, but the writings of learned rabbinical figures over the years, and I think that's important and right. I will add that if you look at international law on the laws of war, it is based on an ethical code which is primarily Christian. It's not Jewish. And so if you talk about the law of conduct of soldiers in combat, it primarily comes from the religious writings of Thomas Aquinas. If we talk about conditions of going to war, just war theory, a lot of it is based on Augustine. These are very prominent religious figures, but they're not in the Jewish religious tradition, they're in the Christian religious tradition. And it wouldn't be a bad thing if we would pay more attention to the Jewish religious tradition in formulating our own morality of war.
How, I don't know if you can answer this, where would that be distinct from the Christian tradition?
It's a little complex, and the reason it's so complex is that, unfortunately, the Jews were powerless for so many years that there weren't all these Jewish kings coming and asking these questions: is this just? Is that just? May I attack now? How may I attack? And so all of our sources are very old. There's been all these many centuries of development of Christian thought about these subjects that there hasn't been in Jewish thought. That said, in the last 100 years, we've begun to see some Jewish thought on this, and it's hard to say at this point, but I think it might be that ultimately we'll end up in a different place. I think that the Jewish tradition would not distinguish itself from the core ideas that you find in the Christian tradition, that we're trying to cause the least human suffering possible, that we have not just a right but a duty to defend life, and that we have a tradition, the Jewish tradition, it's very strong, that our blood is no less red than theirs, that is, we have the right and duty to defend ourselves before we defend those who are trying to attack us, and in fact, we may go and attack them first. But translating this into a concrete military code is something that doesn't happen instantly and will take time. And one of the opportunities and privileges we have about being now in a Jewish state is that we can now redevelop and reconnect this abstract morality to real, concrete moral dilemmas that you have when you have a military.
My understanding is that Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of the army, let's say, during the 1967 war, although not only was very involved with that, for example, something that would be unique to Judaism is Shabbat. Okay, you can defend yourself on Shabbat, which also isn't to be taken for granted. That's only something the Maccabees came up with because we were literally sitting ducks and getting attacked on Shabbat. But can you preempt? Can you get ready for an attack on Sunday on Shabbat because you have to move your troops to somewhere else? There's a lot of questions here that I think are specific to Judaism because especially of the issues of Shabbat.
Yeah, Rabbi Goren wrote several books about this, and I think that they're very important in formulating our morality. But I will say that there are questions that just haven't come up. You know, that are there rules of weaponry that you're allowed to use and not allowed to use according to Jewish law? Well, maybe these just it hasn't arisen. It was the kinds of weaponry we have today didn't exist in the last time that there was a Jewish army. The Maccabees did not have to deal with the question of whether you can use cluster bombs, for example. Right. So these are all new questions, and as much as Rabbi Goren did, and he did a lot, we've got a lot to still think about.
And it was also quite a few decades ago, and there's new weaponry now that we didn't have before, and also weapons that our enemies have that they didn't have before. So one last question, and I know that you have to get going. Iran, well, this is in the headlines. This is the big issue right now. What do you think is going to happen in the next few weeks with the United States, with Iran? This is a terrible question to ask. My listeners can't see your face, but I'm just going to say it's almost mean. But any ideas?
Yeah, you know what Jewish tradition says about prophecy.
Idiots and children.
Yes. So I don't prophesize. We're in a delicate situation that is not about the current headlines. It's more about the general trajectory of Iran ever since the revolution. Since the revolution, Iran is an expansionist and radical world power that employs aggressiveness towards its neighbors, terrorist organizations that it controls, and a fanatic hatred of Jews as well as other peoples. They hate the Baha'i. But there's a fanatic amount of hatred there, and this is a dangerous cocktail. And with their nuclear weapons program as advanced as it is, this will come to a head sooner or later. I don't know how soon it will be, but it's unavoidable.
Unless maybe there's regime change in Iran, and then the Iranian people can rise and we can all go home.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Yeah, that is an option. Who knows? We never know. Thank you so much, Professor Avi Bell, for joining me here today at the Shurat Hadin Law and War Conference in Jerusalem. Hi, everybody. Still Eve Harrow and still at the Dan Hotel in Jerusalem, and it's still June 25th, 2019. I'm just surrounded by lawyers today. It's lucky I've been behaving. So I'm sitting now with Ann Hertzberg, who I interviewed a few years ago from NGO Monitor. But one or two things have happened since then, and you're going to be presenting tomorrow, and I'm not sure I'm going to be here. So thanks for agreeing to sit with me now.
Thanks, Eve, so much for having me.
All right, so tell my listeners, what's NGO Monitor? What are you going to be talking about tomorrow, which by the time you hear this, guys, will have already happened. But you're kind of getting a preview anyway.
Hi. So we are a Jerusalem-based research organization that looks at the funding and activities of NGOs in the Arab-Israeli conflict.
NGOs being?
Non-governmental organizations. And surprisingly, a lot of these organizations promote humanitarian aid, human rights, but at the same time are the key actors in delegitimizing Israel. Spearheading.
Funny how that works.
Very funny, very funny. Unfortunately, many of these groups promote anti-Semitism. Many of them partner with organizations that are linked to terror groups. And so we try to identify that material and then present it to the funders and hopefully get their grants cut off.
So, I mean, people have been asking me that for years. For example, I'm just going to throw that out there. I hope they don't sue me. The New Israel Fund, for example, where people will say to me, oh, but they do such great pro-feminist work and they support all these other organizations that some of them are doing wonderful things, but a big part of their agenda also seems, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. You're pro-human rights, but you're anti-Israel, which happens to be one of the countries that I think probably has the best record of human rights in the world. So anti-Semitism is fitting in here? We're seeing that ugly little bubble popping up?
So unfortunately, New Israel Fund's a complicated case. Like as you mentioned, they do have organizations they work with that are promoting positive things within Israel. But unfortunately, not many, but there's a cadre of groups, maybe about 20 organizations that work with BDS organizations. Sometimes they appear at the UN with committees that are very anti-Israel. And a big problem I have is, if they're doing work within Israel, I think that's totally legitimate. They're human, it's great that every country, every democratic society has voices that, keep the government honest. But in this case, many of those organizations go outside of Israel and they try to pressure the country. And they seem to ally all too often with groups that do not have Israel's best interests at heart.
So I was just, because I'm a tour guide, so I've been around, and you go, let's say, into the Shomron, for example, or even on my way in here this morning, I took a shortcut. I went through Walajah around Bethlehem, and big signs, U.S. Aid. Now, you're going to find these U.S. Aid signs only in areas of the Palestinian Authority. You're never going to find them in the Jewish community of Judea and Samaria. It seems that it's only all this money, U.S. taxpayer money, is only going to one group, and there's other people that also need this. So in addition to perhaps fomenting BDS and aiding some of the enemies, there also seems to be an imbalance when it comes to where some of this money's going.
Yeah, it's really ridiculous. If you look at the Palestinian organizations or organizations that work on Palestinian issues, get some of the highest amounts of funding globally from the UN, from the European Union, from other, Canada, Australia, United States. Although right now the United States has frozen a lot of the aid. It's totally disproportionate. Much of the funding is going for damaging projects. It's not going for projects that's going to hopefully build up a strong civil society in the Palestinian Authority, rights-respecting, liberal, open, democratic society. And instead, it just often perpetuates this very negative mindset, this very destructive zero-sum mindset that's going on, unfortunately.
So who's the policeman of these non-government organizations? If they're doing, and I've no reason to doubt it, and I've been reading your reports, and Gerald Steinberg, I know for a long time, who runs NGO Monitor. Are you guys now the policemen of the NGOs?
So it's pretty much, that's what's really disturbing. We're the only group in the world that is looking at this type of information and putting out reports on it, meeting with diplomats. But tomorrow, actually, I'm going to be moderating a panel with several people who've been very active in combating BDS campaigns. And what's nice to see, being from NGO Monitor, is that many people now are going on the offensive to attack these campaigns, these destructive campaigns of these BDS groups and other NGOs, and really trying to hamper what they're doing to harm Israel and Jews around the globe.
Well, just this week, Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, who got the Genesis Prize of $1 million, he doesn't need it. So he added $19 million of his own, $20 million to fighting BDS. Do you think that was an important step to take?
Yeah, I think all the money that we have can help, because when everyone says, there's an imbalance there. The Palestinians are the weaker party. Israel's this very strong country. And while that's true, when it comes to campaigns, BDS, all of this anti-Israel activism, those groups that are promoting those types of campaigns have hundreds of millions of dollars that they're getting to carry out those campaigns. And when you compare the amount of money that is being used to counter anti-Semitism, to counter BDS, it's much less. So I am a Patriots fan, so it was great to see Robert Kraft stepping up like that. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. We're going to hear from Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who's done
Eugene's amazing.
Amazing. He's done incredible work in the United States to have states enact legislation to block BDS efforts there. And, of course, Nitzana from Shirat Din, and all the legal action where they're really, taking efforts that the BDS groups are doing against Israel and turning it on their head and using it against them, right back at them. And I think that's just a great thing that they're doing.
Are you guys active on campus, which, as we all know, with intersectionality and all this crazy stuff that you almost can't be pro-Israel on campus because you're just going to get all this stuff thrown at you. It's a racist, apartheid, like Israel just does all these terrible, terrible things. So does NGO Monitor work on campus?
So in general, we don't work on campus. Our website has many materials, and when, often we have campus groups writing to us and we provide them with information. Our information's free for everyone to use. And if anyone has questions, we're happy to help you out. We try to speak mostly with diplomats, UN officials, to try to work on things on that level, because there's so many, great groups in the States and in England that are working on campus. So we kind of see ourselves in a support role in those places.
Are you optimistic? Because on the one hand, there's organizations like yours and others who are really stepping up. On the other hand, we just see more and more anti-Semitism around the world. I was just reading a report this morning that of the countries that may soon be ethnically cleansed of their Jews, you can put Sweden on the list. Now, you want to talk about Tunisia or some of the Arab countries or maybe Venezuela, which is totally chaotic. But Sweden, yet you cannot walk around with any visible signs of being Jewish there. And there's just this really big sense of that you have to get out.
Yeah, it's what's not surprising is we see a direct correlation in the countries that provide the most funding to organizations involved in BDS and Palestinian rejectionism are the countries where it is the most hostile to Jews. Sweden is probably the prime example. So it doesn't surprise me that the atmosphere there is so hostile. I think it's a real, the Swedish government touts itself as this feminist government, this liberal government, and they're just awful. The stories coming out of Sweden every week, you hear another terrible story. But on the one hand, Israel's doing great. Our economy is great. Tourism is up. I think things in Israel have never been better. But it's important. We have to remain vigilant. I feel badly, though, for Jews around the globe, and the rise in anti-Semitism. So I think a lot of efforts, really, when you fight a lot of BDS activists are also quite active in promoting anti-Semitic rhetoric and campaigns also around the globe. There also is a direct correlation with those types of people. And so by combating BDS, you also are combating anti-Semitism. So hopefully all of these programs and recent efforts by the German government to equate BDS and anti-Semitism will help start providing tools in which governments can make the environment better for Jews.
Are you more concerned about the far left or the far right? Because you see, like in Europe, you're having some frightening, people coming out from the far right, yet maybe more in other Western countries, you're having some really nasty things coming from the far left. So do both concern you equally?
Yeah, both are really a problem. You have neo-Nazism on the right, but honestly, a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the far left is quite indistinguishable from neo-Nazism. A lot of the imagery and the comments they make are nearly indistinguishable from neo-Nazism. So,
let's say like a New York Times caricature, exactly, for example.
Exactly, or the things, unfortunately you see coming out of UK Labour, and many other places. The actor John Cusack, who claims to be this, Bernie bro and, extreme left individual, but yet he's posting cartoons that look like Der Stürmer. So we have to combat both. You can't close your eyes to extremism on either side.
And look, many of my listeners are Christians, and I guide Christians, and I go speak in churches, and I get mail from people. So I know that they're also concerned that there is finally a dawning of an understanding that whoever's coming after the Jews is not just coming after the Jews. They're coming after Jews maybe because we're right out there when it comes to also doing well, working hard and doing well, but also to some degree maybe being, showing like God's people in the world. And then, so maybe this is a little murkier than it just seems. Like it's not just about the Jews. And of course we have the pastor, of course, Niemöller, the famous passageway from World War II, the passage that he said in World War II, they came for everybody. I didn't defend anybody else. And then there was no one left to defend me. I'm paraphrasing. And so do you see some of the support that NGO Monitor is also coming from Christians who understand that this is not just about Israel and the Jews?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's a perfect example. This week at the UN in Geneva, the Palestinian Committee is hosting a conference on Jerusalem. And when you look at the actors, it's supposedly going to be talking about all three monotheistic religions. But when you look at the people that are coming to speak, they're almost all Islamic. And the Jews and the Christians speaking are, radical. They don't represent mainstream voices. And I think it's pretty clear that at the end of the day, that conference is going to be delegitimizing both Jewish and Christian historical ties to Jerusalem. So it's really critical, I think, in the Christian community. Unfortunately, also in Europe, a lot of churches, the World Council of Churches in particular, are very involved in funding delegitimization. And so, the support from the evangelical community and a lot of other churches and Christian groups in Europe is vital. And there's a lot of friends out there. But you have to remain vigilant because it's not just an attack. When they attack Jewish historical ties, they are also attacking Christian history, Christian roots.
Yeah, I deal with that all the time, the people who say there was no King David. Well, in that case, that kind of puts the kibosh both on for Jews and for Christians. It's a really insulting thing, and we do have to be vigilant on that. Okay, so Ann Hertzberg, thank you so much. Good luck tomorrow.
Thanks a lot, Eve. Thank you.
It was great to see you again. Keep up the great work.
On a very special edition of Israel Uncensored with Josh Haston, the New England Patriots arrive in Israel. Hear exclusive interviews from Julian Edelman, Drew Bledsoe, Ty Law, and more.
What does it mean for you to be in Israel?
It means a lot. To come to the Holy Land and actually see American football.
It's pretty heartwarming to come out here and have
and all the Israeli fans screaming your name.
It's such an amazing combination of brand new and very old, and the soulful and the spirituality here.
For more coverage of the Touchdown in Israel event in Jerusalem, listen to Israel Uncensored on the Land of Israel.